Videos for today's lecture since I'm not on campus. So let's start talking about chapter 7, which is talent development. One advantage for you all in this chapter is that some of the things that we're going to learn in this chapter are things you're already doing in school, because at some level we're developing talent through you. You're learning specific skills and knowledge for your degree programs and for your classes, maybe not for a job, but a lot of the principles that apply to college education would also apply to a lot of the things we're going to learn in this chapter about training and development on the job. So before we start doing training in a workplace, we need to do a needs assessment. And a needs assessment tells us what might be happening in the workplace that perhaps training could help, but perhaps there are other solutions for it. So the most important question when we do a needs assessment is what kind of is your pain? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And we want to talk through this. If any of you go into consulting, this is exactly what consultants do. Often in the very first meeting, they're trying to figure out what their client's asking them to do. But that's the same thing for a trainer, whether that trainer is part of the organization or is a consultant who's paid from the outside. A lot of things can affect performance. And so one thing we need to figure out is, why is this problem occurring? Is this a problem where your employees don't know how to do something or do a process very efficiently or productively, and they need to learn how to do that? Or is it a problem with the equipment? Your equipment's old or out of date and it's not working as well as it should, so your employees can't be as productive as they want to be. Is it a motivation problem? Are your employees not motivated to do a very good job? Do you not pay them very well so they don't feel like they need to be more productive? Is this a problem with your management? Are they not doing a very good job of overseeing their employees? Do they have good relationships with their employees? Do they understand their employees' needs? Are they helping them to eliminate barriers or reduce challenges that might be hurting them in doing their jobs? There can be lots of things going on in an organization, which is why we need a needs assessment, because often training isn't the only or at all the answer. There's often something else going on underneath. So our book gives some example questions that you would use with a client to figure out if they need training. And you can look at these when you're studying for the test, but essentially it's just asking what is the problem and then kind of delving into the details of what that problem is to figure out if training or any kind of training for any kind of process with employees or managers would be helpful. We can do a needs assessment at 3 different levels, and we usually do have to do it at all 3 levels to figure out what's really going on. One is at the organizational level. We need to figure out if training for this specific problem would actually be consistent with the organization's strategy. Do they have the resources to provide that training, or might they need to get that training elsewhere? And then whether leadership has buy-in for this training. So this is kind of like everything else we've done in this class so far. A lot of it is up to the organization's strategy, whether we do this or not, and then how we invest in training for our employees. The next kind of needs assessment is task. This is where you want to identify tasks that need to be performed to do a job. And you might need to figure out what the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics are that are required to do that job or to do specific tasks within a job. This is where job descriptions can be helpful, but that can also then help you figure out, do all of your employees have all of those KSAOs that they need to do the tasks for their job? And then finally, at the person level, this is where if employees don't have those KSAOs, we might think that they might need training. We can also look and see if we can redesign the work in a way that would either avoid using KSAOs that the employee doesn't have, or to help them learn them while they're doing the actual work. We might have resources that are needed that the employees don't actually have, and sometimes it's a motivation problem. I will say, in my own experience in doing this process, sometimes people don't know what the problem is, or they can't see the problem. They can't tell you, like, this is exactly what's going on. So that's why you have to ask lots of questions, because sometimes as an outsider, you will see something that people who are working on the inside can't. And that's when you might have some insight about whether training is actually helpful or not for that particular problem. After you've done your needs assessment, you want to establish a baseline. So this is data that helps you determine where your employees are at, where your managers are at, where the organization is at before you've started the training and development program that you're going to use with with whoever needs to be involved in that. So this gives you a baseline of where we started, and this helps you to compare later after the training whether things have improved and if you've done better than where you were at in the baseline. And the baseline can be any kind of data. It could be company reports, it can be customer reviews, it could be surveys with employees, it could be assessments. There could be lots of different kinds of baseline data, and some of it might already be in your HRIS. Some of it you might be doing as specifically to solve this problem and to do it before you start the training program for employees. Another thing our book talks about, and I'm just going to briefly mention this, is talent analytics. Some of you may learn about this in the data analytics class if you are a management or HR major. Talent analytics isn't necessarily specific to HR. What it's doing is collecting data about the talent or the people within your organization to kind of well, to have lots of different purposes. This chart shows 4 purposes for talent analytics. So the first or most basic kind is when you're just collecting information to figure out what happened. And that's what we call descriptive analytics. So this is probably the most common kind of data that organizations are collecting because it's the easiest to collect. This is where you might have things like what was the productivity in a quarter, or how many accidents did we have, that sort of thing. The next level up that gives you a little more insight into what's going on is diagnostic analytics, and that actually tells you why something happened. So it's not just that something happened, but the why, because if you get to the why, you might actually start being able to change the situation that created the problem in the first place. The third level is predictive analytics, and this is where you can use data to figure out what might happen in the future. So what will happen? A lot of organizations would like to be at this level, but it requires lots of sophisticated data and lots of data collecting and actually people to analyze some of that data. And a lot of organizations haven't set up that sort of system yet. And then if the kind of height of using talent analytics is what we call prescriptive analytics. How can we make it happen? So instead of describing what has happened or why something happened or what could happen in the future, you're actually starting to control the process, and you might be able to determine the future at some level with the data that you have and making certain decisions based on that data. I just wanted to put this out there for you because some of you will see this, but also you may learn more about it later in the data analytics class. One barrier to training, there are many barriers that we have when we do training, is cost. And this to me is a very common barrier because training itself, especially if you're doing it in-house, can cost a lot of money to develop. You have to pay for the person who's doing the training, the people who are developing the training, you may have to pay for content and that sort of thing. So the other thing you have to think about that's different from a college education is, yes, you all are paying the cost, or you may be getting scholarships, but someone's paying the cost for your education. But you may not be using that education directly in a job because we don't know what knowledge, skills, and abilities you'll need exactly for the job that you'll have when you leave college. But your whole job is to be a student. So you're not really missing out on any work in a specific job or any tasks that you need to do outside of your job as a student because you're not specifically training for your job at a workplace. So that's where you have the benefit of doing a lot more training than people would be able to do at work because you're not missing a job. But that's also what makes training at work even more expensive, because not only are you paying for the cost of the training, you're paying for the hours that people are in training and not actually doing the tasks that are part of their job position. So one method that we can get around, not around the cost, but to convince other people that the costs are worth it, is what we call return on investment. And that tells you how much you're getting back for the training that you're paying for from your employees. And this ROI can help us convince leadership that this training would be useful. It can also show leadership how this training can actually improve processes and help the financial results for that particular organization. People also resist training for many different reasons. I'm going to say this chart's pretty easy probably for a lot of you to relate to, because I have a feeling this is why some of you resist learning in some of your classes. Or especially classes maybe that are not in your major or that you're not particularly interested in. So often the purpose of the training isn't clear. People don't have time to do a training. This is extremely common, especially in places that are understaffed, which is very common now. Employees often don't know what they're supposed to do after the training. So they learn something, but then it's not necessarily applied, which is a problem college students also complain about a lot in classes. Although in the college setting, it's a little bit different because you don't have a specific job you have to apply your knowledge to just yet. Some people are afraid that they'll lose their job if they have this training. And you can think about this in terms of when employees have to learn how to use machinery or other kinds of technology in a workplace. They may be scared that that new technology is going to take their job in the future, and so they resist the training. And there may be other reasons that people resist training. This is extremely common, and it's something that a lot of organizations have to deal with. So you can't just develop a training and expect employees to embrace it and take it and then change their jobs. You often have to spend a little bit of time in that training convincing people why that training is useful and then what they're going to take away from that training. And this is the change curve. Was developed by Kubler-Ross. You may know her if you've ever heard of like the cycle of grief, about how people deal with something that's happened in their lives. So there might be shock, for example, when you first learn about something that is very sad in your life. That's kind of what's happened with change. The idea is that change for a lot of people is very negative. So we have to go through this emotional sort of roller coaster before we accept the change. And so in this particular theory, there are 4 stages that we go through in accepting change. So the first state is what we call status quo, and that's when you have shock or denial in learning that you might need to change the status quo because it's no longer working. And in the second stage is called disruption, where you start having anger and fear about having to make this change. You might resent the fact that you have to make this change. And this is where you're actually starting to do the work to make that change. And so it feels really difficult and hard. And the third stage is called exploration. It's when you start accepting the change because you might be starting to see how the things that you're learning or the things that you're changing are actually starting to have an impact on making changes in the workplace. And hopefully you'll be seeing some positive impacts. And then over some time, there's a rebuilding state where you'll have a commitment to that change because you'll see that this is actually working better than the status quo was. One thing I should mention about this change curve is just like the kind of grief cycle, people can go in and out of these stages. It's not linear. It's not like you go 1, 2, 3, 4. You could go 1, 2, and then back to 1. You could go 1, 2, 3, and then back to 1. You could go 1, 2, 3, and go back to 2. Like there's not necessarily a forward momentum, but the hope is that with training, but also incorporating that training into a job, that we get through this change curve with all employees so that most or all would be ideal are in that 4th stage of commitment after we've made those changes. People also have an innate or an inset readiness to learn. So this is a little bit about our personality, but a lot about our past experiences with learning as well. If an employee is ready to learn, then they're going to be motivated to learn, and hopefully they also have the ability to learn so that the training that they're going into is at their level or even below their level. So it's not something that's way over their head and they're no longer motivated to be part of. A lot of times you have to have some past knowledge to be ready to learn, but the motivation is also an important part of readiness to learn. A lot of us also have just overall impressions or feelings about our own abilities to learn new things. This is called self-efficacy. And so this is our belief to do things. It can be really anything, but in this context, it's our ability to learn something new that we might not know about or not know how to do or have not mastered yet. So people with high self-efficacy are much more likely to have a readiness to learn because they're more likely to believe they can learn and that they can apply that learning to their job. And people with low self-efficacy are more likely to have that resistance to change and resistance to learning that we just learned about. Finally, in this video, I want to talk about instructional design models. You do not need to know the details of these models. I just want you to know that they exist, and I'll just describe them very briefly. The original model of developing training for the workplace was called the ADDIE model, and it actually starts with analyze. That's the A in ADDIE. It's an acronym for the whole model. And I was going to walk through this with you thinking about your group projects because you actually use this model in your group projects to some extent. So analyzing in the workplace is when you analyze the problem that you need to solve and you start trying to figure out how might we solve this problem. This is where we're doing our needs assessment and also potentially determining what kind of training we might need to develop to address the problem in the needs assessment. The second step is designing. So we're going to design the training for you for your group projects. We went to the library and you started finding content and visuals for your for your presentation. So that's part of the design process. Then the develop process is putting that training together so that you have a cohesive training module or a class or whatever it is that you're actually going to provide as part of the training. And in the group project case, you developed a presentation. You probably put slides together, visuals. Some of you made videos where you're actually in the videos instead of having a PowerPoint. That was your development phase. Then you probably went to implementation where you actually filmed that video. In the training context, it's when you actually do the training, or if you're developing like online training, it's when you're putting the modules together and making the videos and that sort of thing. And then you kind of launch that class, or you do that training, and then you'll evaluate it at the end to see if it actually worked, if it met the learning objectives you had for the training, did people learn what they were supposed to, and can they apply it to their jobs? And then kind of tweaking that training to make it better and more effective for employees. SAM is a much newer version of it, and SAM is more applied to like online learning or things that aren't traditional training that we would do in organizations. And this in SAM, it's not as straightforward as ADDIE where you go from one phase to the next. You can go back and forth between these phases. So the first phase is the preparation phase. That's when you're gathering information about the problem you're trying to solve. You might be looking at different ways or models that you could do the training, different ways that people could be learning. And you're working with a group of people usually as well when you're doing SAM. You have other people you're working with to figure this out because it's pretty complicated, whatever it is that you're having to develop. In the next phase, it's called the iterative design phase. Sorry, I can't say that. And this is where you're actually creating your training. This is where the online training, maybe if you think about how you might have to do that, a lot of times online training has to be made before you do the training online, before you make the videos, or before you launch the course in Canvas. So you might have you might design it, you might have a prototype, you might have people testing the prototype, you review it, and then you have to revise that design again, and you're going in this cycle. That's why it's called iterative. Finally, in the third development phase, you're actually going to have like a whole course ready. So you might have a design proof showing kind of what this course should look like, how people should be walking through the course, and you'll have alpha and beta versions of the course where you have people trying out the course, making sure that there's a logical sequence, that all of the parts of that course work the way they're supposed to, and then eventually you'll have the final design of that course, the kind of the gold version of that course that you'll roll out to learners after you've done a lot of testing. So SAM requires lots of testing and it's very iterative compared to ADDIE.